Welcome this evening to the Pony Club Victoria Saddle Fitting webinar with our guest presenter tonight, Robert McCann. Robert has spent over 20 years travelling across Victoria and Australia to assist his clients with their saddle fitting needs. Robert has also been a dedicated Pony Club dad. And we thank Robert for offering his time to our members and presenting this fantastic webinar tonight. Over to you, Robert.
Okay. Hello to everyone who I can't see, unfortunately, but I hope to try and pass on a bit of information to you tonight. Just first of all, to give you a little bit of a background to me, perhaps put up that next slide, Kathleen. I've been a professional horseman now for, well, in excess of 40 years, believe it or not. And I've been involved in saddle fitting specifically for over 20 years. I started my career as a horse breaker and trainer, and with a big interest in the saddle very early on in the piece. And when I got more involved in the saddlery side of the industry, I fairly quickly discovered that there was nowhere in Australia to do any training. So I took myself off to England and studied with the Society of Master Saddlers in England. They've been running saddle fitting courses and courses, everything to do with saddles for years and years and years. So, so I studied with them and consequently or subsequently passed the exam. So I'm still currently a full member of the Society of Master Saddlers in the UK and what they call a Master Saddle Fitter. So I've been working virtually full time as a saddle fitter now for in excess of 20 years. So, so that's why I feel that I have the right to say a few things about saddle fitting, and hopefully some of it will be useful to you. So we move along to that next slide, Kathleen. Now, Kathleen handles the questions, so if any questions come up, don't hesitate to do whatever it is you do and get them through to Kathleen. I just first of all wanted to talk about what I'll focus on tonight. One of the most important elements, which is very often misunderstood and overlooked a little bit, is saddle position. Exactly where do we put the saddle on the back and why do we put it there? It's no good understanding about saddle fitting unless you understand a bit about the underlying anatomy of a horse and therefore the consequences of not having that saddle in the right position. An interesting bit of trivia that this happened over 20 years ago. There was a very learned man at Melbourne University interested in back pain in horses, and he did a survey at that stage of 1,000 horses Australia-wide, and he surveyed everything from Olympic level riders right down to Pony Club riders. And he discovered, as part of that survey, he discovered quite a few things, but as part of that survey, one of the things he discovered is that about 80% of saddles were being sat too far forward. Now, that's a huge number when you stop and think about it. And once we, as you'll hopefully learn in the next little while, that can have great ramifications for the horse's ability to work as well as your ability to ride him. So, so I'll talk quite a bit about saddle position. I'll talk about how important the level seat is. In getting that, the relationship between the pommel and the cantle, clearance under the pommel, the angle of the points, panel pressure, how important it is to get an even distribution of weight right along the length of the panel and why we want to do that. Obviously, gullet clearance is something, that's probably the one issue that a lot of people do have a bit of an understanding on, but how gullet clearance affects seat line and therefore the balance of the saddle. So, so there's some of the things that I'm going to try and touch on tonight, and hopefully we can all learn a bit. All right, Kathleen, if we bring up that next slide. So the first thing I want to try and get you guys to understand is, exactly where the saddle platform is. In other words, the part of the horse's back that we are allowed to use or should use as riders and horse people, and what exactly determines the saddle platform. So if you have a look in that that slide that's up there now, you see the red, the part highlighted in red there, they're the spinous processes of the horse's back. So the actual horse's spine is set quite lower down in the back. It's not the little lumps that you feel along a horse's back. They're up to sort of 6 to 8 inches down below that is the actual spine itself. Those spinous processes are very important for the articulation of the horse and his ability to move nice and freely. That big white flat bone in front there is his shoulder bone, or scapula, as we would understand it in people. Very important to understand exactly what the scapula on a horse, how it differs to a human being. Our scapula sits in the middle of our back. It's that bony ridge we can feel just behind our shoulder. And because we've got a ball and socket joint in our shoulder blade only moves in 2 different directions. It rotates back and forth, okay? Back and forth like that. A horse's shoulder blade moves in 6 different directions. His ball and socket joint is much lower down. It's at the point of the elbow there. So the difference is that we can cut a horse's front leg and shoulder blade off without disturbing a joint. It's only attached by ligaments, tendons and muscles, which are all collectively referred to as soft tissue. The 6 different directions that he moves, he has scapular rotation, the same as us, so it moves back and forth like that. He also has scapular glide. He can glide the whole shoulder blade back and forward over the top of his rib cage. As you can see in that photograph, shoulder blade sits atop his rib cage, and it can slide back and forth over that rib cage. He also can adduct and abduct his shoulder, which simply means he can suck his shoulder into his body, or he can push it further away from his body. The reason he has to be able to move his shoulder like that is that because he has his 2 front legs situated either side of his chest. Now, when a horse goes forward and he needs to step around that chest, he needs to be able to suck the inside shoulder in, push the outside shoulder out, slide the outside shoulder forward, and that enables him to use his legs to step around his own chest. If we impinge on that shoulder blade, we restrict all those movements. Now, it's a complicated joint that has a lot of muscles and ligaments and tendons involved in it. If we go and sit a saddle on top of it, we impinge his ability to use it. And we make him sore very, very quickly as well, because all those small muscles and ligaments underneath his shoulder get squashed by our weight. So it's the back edge of that shoulder, where that square is on the horse, or that oblong, that front edge. So that's the back edge of the saddle the front edge of the saddle platform. We can't sit a weight-bearing part of the saddle any further forward than that. And the term weight-bearing, which I'll explain in much more detail as we go on, that's the crucial thing. So when we put a saddle on a horse, we want the tree of the saddle, as we'll see in a minute in another slide, want the tree of the saddle behind his shoulder blade. Now we go to the back edge of that square. We're now talking about the 18th thoracic vertebrae. Now, as you can see in that diagram, it's the last vertebrae that has a rib attached to it. And it's actually those ribs coming down through the horse's side that actually give his backbone and spine the ability to support the weight. So we want the rider and the saddle and all the weight bearing sitting over that rib cage. So we don't want any weight bearing beyond T18. So now we've suddenly defined a very specific area of the horse's back, which is the saddle platform. And that's the area of the back that he's physically designed to carry weight, physically able to carry weight, and puts the rider in the most balanced position as well. So very important that as riders, we should be able to identify the back edge of that shoulder blade, and we should be able to identify the last rib. Now, we can't actually feel the 18th thoracic vertebrae because, as I said to you before, it's buried down there under about 4 to 6 inches of muscle at that back point of the saddle. But what we can do is we can feel that last rib just there in front of the flank. What we do is we bring our fingers forward from the hair whorl that runs up their flank. We bring it forward and we'll feel that last rib there. We we run our fingers up that last rib, and that will point us to where T18 is. Okay, so anybody who's putting a saddle on a horse should be aware of those 2 points, so that they can tell, first of all, that the saddle isn't too far forward and on the shoulder, and secondly, that the saddle isn't too long or far back for the horse's back. Now, those 2 points become really important when it comes to seat size selection. Not such a problem if we've got a big adult on a big horse, but can be quite an issue when we've got an adult-sized rider wanting to ride a smaller pony. And we look at the rider, and they might require a 17-inch saddle, but when we measure that saddle platform, we've only got enough room to put 16.5 inches of saddle. So something to bear in mind, and something that I quite often have to try and overcome and help with people. Okay, so that's the saddle platform. Now we move along to that next slide, please, Kathleen. So this is just showing you more about that exactly where that shoulder is in relationship to the wither and to the rib cage. What I also would like you to notice from this slide is that when we talk about saddle position, people often talk about girth position. They often talk about, the saddle's too far back because the girth isn't sitting in the elbow. Now that's one of those old wives' tales that can lead us into a lot of problems, because in actual fact, what determines the girth position is the shoulder position up the top. If we take a look at where that red arrow points, and if we run straight down to the girth line of the horse, we then realise that on this particular skeleton, by the time we put the saddle on, the girth's going to come out of the middle of the saddle or a bit further back. So the girth isn't going to be anywhere near the back of his elbow. It's actually going to sit, probably as much as 6 inches behind his elbow. And that's fine. But particularly on this shaped horse, he's got a nice flat girth area there. That is fine. We don't want to be positioning a saddle according to the girth position. We position the saddle according to that shoulder blade. So it's something that you should really strive to be able to identify. Now, just to make it sometimes a bit more difficult, there could be several different styles of shoulder on a horse. We can have what we call a blending shoulder, and that's when that shoulder blade, particularly on the heavier bred horses, some of the Clydesdale crosses, the quarter horses, even the warm bloods, and some of the ponies, that shoulder blade will totally blend in with the muscle directly behind it. And so it can be quite a challenge to actually find the back edge of that shoulder. You have to sort of poke through the muscle and the tissue at that point and locate it. If you have trouble locating it, often picking the front leg off the ground and moving that leg back and forth while you're feeling that area of the back will allow you to feel it much more easily. The other type of shoulder that we'll have is what we call a loaded shoulder. Now, we'll often see this on some of the thoroughbreds and some of the finer built horses, and that's where that shoulder blade sits right up and it becomes really obvious, but then it will have a hollow in behind it. And so locating the shoulder blade can be, you can sort of see it from 10 feet away, very easy to see. But it can be really interesting to locate the back edge of that shoulder and then locate it in relationship to the back of that elbow. And that will give you an idea of where the girth is going to fall. Now, if the shoulder happens to be set well forward, and so that line brings the back of the shoulder in line with the elbow or a little bit in front of the elbow, then yes, the girth will want to sit right in the elbow of the horse. It'll sit right up there close to those front legs. But if that shoulder blade is set back, and sometimes it can be set quite a long way back. It's an interesting exercise if you've got half a dozen horses lined up at pony club or adult riding club or something, just to go along and feel their shoulders and check that relationship between the elbow and the shoulder. And you'll be surprised, and really surprised, how different that relationship can be, how varied it is. Sometimes it's right level with the elbow, sometimes it's up to 6 or 8 inches back. And that will vary the picture that you're going to have when that horse is saddled, because the girth will look altogether either too far forward or too far back, or sometimes just right. So a good little exercise to undertake with your own horse, just to understand, are you positioning the saddle because of where the girth looks like it should fit, or are you positioning the saddle because of that, where it should fit behind that shoulder blade? So, so yeah, interesting exercise to undertake. We'll have a look at the next slide, please, Catherine. So this is just showing you a photo of the saddle on the horse in relationship to those skeletal landmarks. And on this particular one, it's interesting what we were just talking about. We look at where those two girth points are pointing, and that horse, when he's girthed up, that saddle, that girth is going to sit a long way back from his elbow. And a lot of people would look at that and straight away say, oh, no, the saddle has to come forward. That's not the case, okay? We'll talk a bit more about girthing later on, but girth position is always a separate problem to solve over saddle fitting. So we always fit the saddle where it should be fitted, behind the shoulder. If that creates a problem with the girth, and it can do, some horses will have quite a specific girth notch that's quite close in under their elbow, and if you try and girth them up any further back than that, the girth will constantly keep sliding into their elbow. Other times you'll have a horse that's got, he's got quite a greyhoundy type build where it really tapers towards the back. So if we try and girth up in this position, as in this photo, then the girth would want to keep sliding back. And so if that's an issue, then we fix that, or we address that by addressing the girth points on the saddle. We may move the girth points. We may use an anatomical girth or a different shaped girth to solve the problem. We don't ever move the saddle forward onto the shoulder to solve the problem. Okay, so we want a nice clear relationship there at the back of that saddle, so that as you can see, I've just realised I can use my pointer. Can you see my pointer if I do it on the slides or not? No. All right. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, that you can see where that front of that saddle sitting behind the shoulder there. We can see that if we go up from the last rib there, the back of the saddle is within the rib cage. So therefore, that saddle's sitting nice and central on the back. Just a few points here about different types of saddles. Now, this particular photo is of a dressage saddle, and a dressage saddle makes it nice and clear because it's nice and straight down the front. So therefore, it sits nice and cleanly behind the shoulder. Now, if we were to put an all-purpose saddle, and even more so with a jumping saddle on a horse, we have the flap that comes forward over the shoulder. But what doesn't move is the tree point. The point of the tree still stays in the same position as it would on a dressage saddle. So even though you've got a flap that's coming forward over the shoulder and appears to be sitting over the shoulder, it's not weight bearing, not taking weight on the shoulder. So a jumping saddle, the flap will come forward over the shoulder as long as the tree point is behind the shoulder blade, then that's fine. Same thing applies to an all-purpose saddle to a lesser degree, but even an all-purpose saddle is a bit more forward cut, and that forward cut part will look like it's sitting on the shoulder, but that's not weight bearing, that's just panel. The tree itself will be back behind the shoulder. So the picture can look different with different types of saddles, but the principles are the same. We're keeping that tree point back behind the shoulder. So make sure that that you can locate that shoulder, and once you put the saddle on and you've girthed it up that initial time, you reach under the saddle blanket, because the saddle blanket will also confuse that front picture, because you'll have the saddle sitting out in front of the saddle and that will be sitting over the shoulder. So you need to put your hand in under the front of that saddle, positively locate the back edge of that shoulder, and make sure that the back edge of that shoulder is in front of the tree point in the saddle, or the front of that saddle. Okay, so hopefully that's the other thing I just wanted to point out about, because we've got the skeleton exposed here, is that where we're actually girthing up, one of the other big misconceptions about girthing horses is just people. It's a bit natural. Everything we do with horses, we try to compare to ourselves, and we think of the girth a bit like a belt around our waist. And in actual fact, it's not around our waist, not around the horse's waist at all. It's actually over the sternum. It's right over where all the ribs join under the bottom of the horse here, which is the sternum, which is this part on us, just here. We can feel where the bone in the middle here finishes and the soft part comes. That's where we're girthing a horse, okay? Now, a little exercise that can help you with empathy for your horse is if you get a belt and put that around your chest here and do it up really tight, and then try and take a deep breath. And suddenly you realise what we're doing when we girth up a horse. We're girthing up their sternum. So the idea with girth tension should be to work on the minimum amount of girth pressure that actually keeps the saddle still. And that's the point of girth, is to keep the saddle still. It's not to be as tight as possible. It's not to be as tight as humanly possible. It's to keep the saddle still. Now, depending on the shape and dimensions of the horse, if you're a really roly-poly horse, then yeah, you've got to do it up pretty tight. But say the average thoroughbred who's got plenty of shape and definition in the back part of his back, the girth doesn't have to be particularly tight at all to keep the saddle still on him. And so aim at understanding that you want the girth to do its job, which is to keep the saddle still, but there's no value, and there's quite a bit of negative impact if we over girth them. Once again, there was a good survey done. It was done for the racing industry, but I think it still has relevance to the sport horse industry. And they found that with a racehorse, by over girthing a horse 10%, they took 2 lengths off him per furlong. Now, 2 lengths doesn't sound like much. That's enough to just between winning a race and running, second last. Now, we're not in racing, but if that applies to racehorses, it also applies to a dressage horse or an eventing horse. You're limiting their ability to perform. So just be a little bit careful on that we're not over girthing our horses. So next slide, please, Kathleen. Now, this has actually moved me on to a little bit about getting a bit more specific about saddle fitting. One of the first things we do is check the gullet. And the way we do that is by taking a wither template. This blue implement you see in this photo is what we call a flexi curve. It's actually a piece of equipment made for draftsmen to enable them to copy circles and bends and different things. It works very, very well as a wither template, and works far better than most of the things that's specifically made to take templates with. So a lot of saddle fitters use these. But what we're doing is we're taking a template of that part of the wither where the gullet will sit in the saddle. So what we do to do that is we locate the back of the shoulder blade. We then want to come about 2 inches behind the back of that shoulder blade, because in a made-up saddle, once it's got all the leather and everything else on it, the gullet plate itself is actually about 2 inches back from the front of the saddle. So that's why we take the template 2 inches back from the back edge of the shoulder blade. So we take that template, we smooth it down both sides, and so what that gives us is a nice visual image of the gullet. Just to show you 2 different types of horses. If you go to the next slide, Kathleen, this is quite a narrow horse, and look at the difference in the shape of this wither compared to the previous horse. Now, that's often one of the things that I get asked often as a saddle fitter is, can I share the one saddle on 2 horses? If these were your 2 horses, the answer would be no, you can't. If they're in a similar neighbourhood when it comes to gullet size, yes, you can. But when they're as far apart as these 2 particular horses that you've just seen, then trying to share saddles on those would be really, really hard. If you are sharing saddles, the golden rule is that you always fit the gullet to the widest horse, and then you see if there is some compromise you can make on the narrower horse. Just to give you another analogy that ties it into something that you might be able to understand, saddles have quite a good comparison to shoe fit in a lot of ways. And if I'm borrowing my big brother's shoes, I can put an inner sole in them, or I can put 2 pairs of socks in them and perhaps get away with using those shoes, as long as they start out too big. However, if I'm borrowing my little brother's shoes and they're one size too small for me, there is nothing I can put inside that shoe that will make it bigger. I can the only thing I might be able to try is to wear it with no socks at all. But understanding that a saddle on a horse's back is quite similar. If it's too narrow, there's nothing you can put underneath that saddle that will make it more comfortable for the horse. And once again, the only way to maybe make it a little bit comfortable is have nothing underneath it at all, depending on how narrow it is, of course. However, if the saddle starts out a little bit too wide for the horse, then yes, there are certain pads and certain things that we can put underneath it that may make that saddle a workable compromise for that horse. So being too narrow is end of story, whereas being too wide, we still may have some room to make that a working compromise. So the other thing that I wanted to mention about gullet measuring, unfortunately, and this is a bit of a bane of a saddle fiddler's life, is that there is no universal standard when it comes to gullet measurement. So what one company calls a medium gullet may be quite different to what another company calls a medium gullet. You might find that one company's medium gullet is more like another company's medium wide gullet. It makes it so it's not automatic that if you had your saddle in, say, you know, a Bates medium gullet, and he went really happy and that worked, and then suddenly you bought yourself a new saddle and it was a different brand of saddle, you know, Klimpke something, for instance. In the Klimpke, he might go in a medium wide gullet. So there is no universal there, and it's not something that is set in stone consequently. So someone says, oh, your horse is a medium gullet, it's always relevant to the saddle you're going to put on it. So yeah, it's very frustrating from a saddle fiddler's point of view that there isn't a universal standard. You know, it becomes even more problematic when we talk about stock saddles and Western saddles, because most of them are made by little boutique makers who make a very, very good product. I'm not knocking the product at all. They make excellent saddles. However, when it comes to gullet dimensions, they all have a slightly different opinion of what is wide or what is extra wide or what is narrow, you know. So again, when I'm recommending you get those sorts of saddles, and they're saddles where the gullets can't be changed, I've got to be very careful about recommending what gullet size they get, because it depends on what brand of saddle or what maker has made the saddle. At least with the big mass-produced saddles, you know, be it Bates or PDS or Pessoa or you know, any of those other big brands, I know what their gullet sizes mean in relationship to most horses, and I can be fairly accurate when I'm recommending the gullet size. But what I'm saying is, because I recommend the gullet size in one brand, doesn't mean it'll be the same in another brand. I hope that's clear. I know it's a bit confusing. So you bring up that next slide, please, Kathleen. This is just to show you, when we're picking gullet sizes, there is a secondary level of consideration too. Okay, the shape or the amount of top line behind the shoulder and down the sides of the horses does dictate exactly where I'm going to go with gullet size. Okay, if we look at these two photos here, it's the same horse underneath. Now he's a horse that's got, you know, not a lot of top line, so he's what we would call in a rafter back. So therefore, his back's got quite a slope on it and slopes away from his spinous processes. Spinous processes are sort of in the middle there at the very top of his wither. So if I was to measure him with a template, as in the bottom picture, then I would end up with quite a narrow gullet on him, which would do a couple of things. It would give him no room to improve in top line. If this was a horse that had been out of work or been injured and was down in top line and we wanted to build the top line up, I'm giving him no scope to improve in that top line there. If I actually leave the gullet a little bit wider, but use the deeper panels as in the top photo in diagram B, and I use the panel to get my lift now, okay? If you look in the bottom photo, because we had the narrow gullet, we had plenty of clearance above it, and that wasn't an issue. in the top one, we haven't got as much gullet clearance in the front, but we've got plenty of room in the panel to add stuffing in the panel and get our clearance through using the stuffing in the panel. And that will have the consequence of leaving his shoulder free. His shoulder won't come back and impact on that gullet plate, which you would do in the bottom photo. It also means as he builds top line, he's pushing out against the panel, which has soft give in it, rather than a hard metal gullet plate. So in the bottom diagram, that horse would actually be punished as he builds up, and we'd have to change that saddle very quickly as he built top line. In the top diagram there, we've got a little bit of leeway for give. He's going to not come up against a hard gullet plate, so he's going to be encouraged to build top line, and consequently we're going to have more forgiveness in that panel, and we won't be back quite as soon. If he changes drastically, we'll still have to be back fairly soon to alter the saddle, but it'll give us some leeway to move there. Okay, it's probably a good point to talk about. How often you should have your saddle fitted. It's a question I'm asked all the time, and we do have to understand, and this diagram gives us a bit of an idea of how much horses can change. They can change, and they can change very quickly. They will change because of several reasons, dozens of reasons, from the amount of feed, the amount of work, their health, obviously, injuries. So if we have a horse that is in work, in good condition, and everything stays fairly normal and straightforward, checking their saddle fitting once every 12 months is adequate. And that's probably the general rule that people will talk about. If nothing changes, once every 12 months we should check just to see if there's either some growing or some aging that's changing it a bit, and we'll adjust the saddle accordingly. However, if he's a young horse, say under 5 years of age or 5 or 6 years of age, he's growing a lot and quite dramatically, you should check his saddle fitting at least every 6 months, if not 4 months, because horses tend to grow in fits and starts. They won't grow at all for 2 or 3 months, and then in 1 month they'll grow an enormous amount. So, a young horse will have to have his saddle fitted regularly, at least every 6 months. At the other end of the spectrum, an older horse, as they get into their higher teens, then they tend to change shape quicker as they age. One of the things that happens with the horse is he gets deeper in the back. The curve of his spine gets deeper as he ages. So, and that starts to happen quicker as he gets older. So a horse, say, over 18 or 17 or 18, he probably has to have his saddle fitted every 6 months. The other thing that I come across a lot is we go out and we buy a new horse and we bring it home, and it may have been in full work with the previous owner, but you're going to feed it differently, you're going to ride it differently, it's going to live in a different climate, live in a different environment. That horse is going to change enormously in the first 4 to 6 months. So if you buy a new horse, you should get your saddle fitted, obviously, when you buy it, when you start out with your saddle. But then you should have that saddle fitting checked somewhere between 4 to 6 months, because that horse will change a lot under a new owner. And that may go on for 12 or 18 months before he really settles in to what is his new normal with his new owner. So be aware of that when you buy a horse, that you will change it. And it's not that it's quite often a positive change. It's not a negative thing. It's just the fact that your feed regime, your work regime, the type of work you do, you might be much more demanding than the previous owner. The previous owner might have just gone for a gentle ride around the block for half an hour, 4 or 5 times a week, and whereas you get on a menage and do some proper collecting work, that horse will change. The other thing that I've seen quite a lot and may surprise some people, especially with young riders, say, the riders in that sort of 15 to 18 age bracket, they may have been, playing at their riding, I suppose, a bit up until that age, and all of a sudden they get quite serious and they take on a new instructor, and that instructor sort of gets the penny to drop, so to speak, and suddenly they do understand how to work a horse properly and use that horse properly and get him to use himself properly. And they may have owned that horse for 3 or 4 years, but in the next 4 to 6 months after they get that new instructor, that horse's shape can change really dramatically, because suddenly the instructor is getting the rider to ride you know, much more correctly, using the horse's body much better, getting the horse to use his back better. And so consequently, he builds muscle where he hasn't had muscle before. So that's something to really be aware of. A simple change of instructor can change the shape of your horse quite dramatically. So be aware of that. So next slide, please, Kathleen. This is just to give you a bit of a visual and to start to talk about balance in the seat line, etc. So we look at the clearance in the front of this saddle. Now, one of the things you will hear from Pony Club, etc., you'll hear, oh, you must have, you know, 3 fingers of clearance under the front of the saddle. Well, that's not actually true, or because what you must have is we must have clearance under the front of the saddle with a balanced seat line. Now, depending on the line of that back and how that horse is built, with some horses, we've got no hope of ever having 3 fingers of clearance. Other horses, we might have 4 or 5 fingers of clearance. What we want, the golden rule, and it has to be read as an entirety from the start of this sentence to the back. We must have absolute clearance under weight with no contact on the wither at all. Okay? What we then must understand is if I'm not touching the wither at all, underweight, with a rider up, if I'm not touching it at all with 1 finger of clearance, am I touching the wither any less with 4 or 5 fingers of clearance? So just to get you to understand, my hands aren't touching there at all. There's no contact. Are they touching less if I do that? The answer is, this is where it'd be great to have an audience that could yell out, no, 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 no. And I could hear you all saying it. So understand that principle, that clearance isn't about how much. It's about absolute clearance for a start. And then you look at what you need to do with the seat line to get a balance in that seat line. And that will often dictate how much clearance you're going to have at the end. So if I've got, you know, if we look at this saddle and the next couple of slides make it much more obvious, but we'll stay here for a minute. You can see that the back of this saddle is too low in relationship to the front. So we've got good clearance in front, no problems. But we need to be able to bring the back of that saddle up or take the front down. So how much clearance I end up with in the front is dictated to me by that balance in the seat line. It is one of the reasons why I look at some saddles and say, look, with this saddle, I cannot get clearance and balance at the same time. And if I can't get that out of a saddle, then we can't use that saddle. That saddle is unsuitable for that particular horse. Okay? So there's no compromise on having absolute clearance, but absolute clearance isn't about the amount of clearance. In other words, if it's 1 inch or 5 inches, that's not going to affect the horse any other way apart from affecting the balance in the seat line. The other thing I wanted to point out about this particular photo is width in the clearance as well. If you look at the way the panels relate to the front of the wither here, not so much from a height point of view, but laterally from left to right. A lot of people, when they check wither clearance, they'll put their hand under the front of the saddle like that. And they'll say, yeah, it's got 3 fingers or 2 fingers or whatever the case may be. In actual fact, when I check a saddle, I do it this way. And I want these 2 fingers to be able to go down the side of the wither. And then I move this finger up and down to see if I've got positive clearance. I want that lateral clearance. When a horse turns, the top part of his wither there under the front of the saddle does what we call cant. In other words, it leans. As he turns, it leans. So if we want that wither, him to be able to turn a corner and use his withers and use his back and shoulders properly, then we need to have that wither be able to do that under the front of the saddle. And that comes about because we've got that lateral clearance as well as the vertical clearance. Okay? So it's very important that we can get our fingers down either side. You'll find a lot of saddles, and jump saddles can be particularly guilty of this. Those panels at the front will come right up level with the top of the horse's wither. And then you very easily get a pinching sensation in the wither there. So make sure that we have that lateral clearance as well. Next slide, please, Kathleen. So this is just showing you the exactly what I was getting at there. So we see when we look at the front of the saddle, we've got plenty of clearance, but that's only relevant when we look at that side view. We see the relationship between the front and the back. Every saddle on the market is designed so that the back of the saddle sits a little bit higher in the front. There isn't a saddle out there, apart from a side saddle, which I don't think a lot of you are riding in, where the saddle is designed to have the back, the cantle of the saddle sitting lower than the pommel, all right? We must be a little bit lower in front. What does vary from make to make and style to style is how much that back of the saddle sits higher than the front. On certain types of deep-seated dressage saddles, the back will sit up 3 or 4 inches higher than the front. But what we're really looking at, see that centre arrow, that solid green arrow that comes down into the centre of the seat. I want the centre of the seat to be in the centre. That's where I want your weight coming down through, the centre of the saddle. When we get that to happen, we get a distribution along the whole panel from front to back, evenly, okay? So, because one of the main elements of saddle fitting, or the mantras of saddle fitting, is that we want the saddle to distribute the rider's weight over as large an area as evenly as possible. It's that footprint of the saddle, okay? I want that footprint to be nice and broad and big and even, okay? And if I get the weight coming down through that center of the seat, then I get that nice even distribution, all right? It also means that you'll have less tendency for the saddle. You know, sometimes you look at a saddle without the rider on, it'll have plenty of clearance in front. Then the rider gets on and all of a sudden the clearance disappears. That's usually because you've got a saddle that's drastically out of balance. And if we move along to the next slide, please, Kathleen, we'll start to talk about this, okay? Now, this is a saddle where the balance is all out. It's far too high behind. And so, therefore, see where that arrow is pointing now. Rather than pointing at the centre of the seat, it's pointing towards the front of the saddle. So you see from the bottom photo, the consequence to the rider. The rider will feel like they're riding downhill. And that will mean that they can't get nice and vertical. Their heel, see how the heel will be now back behind the hip, okay? The rider might feel like they're perched and about to fall over a cliff. It's a very uncomfortable position for the rider. This is a classic situation where with no rider up, you may think that you've got enough clearance in front. But as soon as the rider sits in their saddle, it's going to collapse in front. And that's because all the rider's weight is being thrown into the front. Now, this will really lock up the shoulders of the horse. The horse will develop. Now, if he's a bit of a narky, grumpy horse, you know, he might refuse to go with this situation. He just won't move off the spot. He might even get humpy and bucky and carry on. If he's a good, honest horse and he just keeps trying, what he'll do is he'll shorten up his stride in front. And instead of having a nice, long, flowing trot, he'll have a little short, choppy trot in front. He'll feel a bit like riding a washing machine. It'll just be boom, 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 rather than a nice long stride. So he'll put up with it, but he'll compensate for it by the way he goes. So this is a saddle where the seat line is throwing the rider forward. If we go to that next slide, please, Kathleen. Now, this is the opposite. If we look at the relationship between the front and the back, see how the back of the saddle is really lower than the front. As I said before, this is just never right. There's not a saddle that is designed to sit this way. And if your saddle sits this way, or any saddle that you see, then it isn't fitting the horse. And whether it can, you know, it may be able to be fixed, and depending on the type of saddle, depending on whether we've got a change or gullet, all those things, we can fix them. It's certainly not none of these problems are what I'd call catastrophic problems. They're just problems that have to be fixed. So we see where that solid arrow is. It's way back there in the back of the saddle. And if we look at that bottom photo, we see all the rider's weights thrown into that back part of the saddle. The heel is now in front of the hips, so that the rider is feeling like they're in a chair position. They feel like they're riding uphill, and so they can't get vertical, particularly when you're trying to rise to the trot from this position. You feel like you're pulling yourself forward all the time. Riding becomes a lot harder work, rather than being, coming up nice and vertically with the horse's trot. You've got to physically pull yourself forward, okay? Your horse will very likely, now once again, if we get a grumpy horse in this situation, this will be the classic pig root type situation. He'll want to kick out behind, he'll pig root, particularly into his transition. You ask him to go into you sit deep and to go into a canter, and you'll get that pig root response from behind, and not much you can do about it, So, and you might, this is where somebody might want to sack a horse because they think he's a terrible horse, but that can be all related to saddle issues. Okay, so again, can be fixed in most cases or in a lot of cases, but it's very uncomfortable for both the rider and the horse. So we go to that next slide, please, Kathleen. So this is just to highlight what that previous slide was showing. So where the two lines in the seat, one is where you should sit, and one is where you are sitting. The other reason I wanted to use this slide was because see how this is a dressage saddle, and see how that flap has that forward angle to it. Okay, a dressage flap should sit nice and vertical, so that it helps you, the rider, get your leg underneath you. So this can be a simple little test. Put your saddle on your horse and have a look at the angle on that flap. Now, if the saddle was too low in front, the angle might be backwards. That flap might angle backwards away from the shoulder. If it's too high in front, like this saddle is, then it's angled forward. The consequences in the seat, we can see the difference in where you should sit as to where the saddle wants you to sit because of the angle. So, very simple little thing that you can do, next time with your horse. Stand him on a nice level square bit of ground, sit the saddle on him, and have a good critical look at that saddle, and just see where the centre of seat is, and say to yourself, well, hang on, is this sitting me where I want to be, or is it sitting me in altogether the wrong position? Little giveaways can be the fact that your instructor, you may have, and once again, getting back to a previous point, this can be all about the change in the shape of the horse too. You may have had this saddle fitted 12 months ago, and it may have fitted really well, and you might have been sitting really balanced. One of the things about balance in the seat that I often point out to people is it goes out of balance very, very slowly, literally millimetres at a time. So you may have had a saddle fitted and you fitted well and you felt nice and balanced. Then suddenly sort of 8 months, 10 months, 12 months later, you might be getting comments from your instructor, oh, sit up, you're leaning back, sit up, sit forward, sit up straight, get your legs back underneath you. You haven't noticed the saddle going out of balance because it happens so slowly that you're just saying that's the way the saddle feels, it's fine. Not until someone comes along and has a critical look at the saddle and say, hang on, the saddle's way out of balance. We adjust it, get it all balanced up, and you sit in and say, oh, yeah, of course, that's how it should feel. So it's very easy to overlook as a rider. We're riding the saddle every day. It's changing in very minute ways every day. We just get used to those changes, and next thing we know, it's out of balance. So something to be sort of mindful of, and to watch, and make sure that you are getting your saddle fitted regularly. Particularly when you start to suddenly get feedback from your instructor that says, suddenly you're leaning forward, sit back, or suddenly you're leaning back, sit forward. It may be that saddle seat line's gone out of balance without you noticing it, and you've got to have your saddle refitted. So, next slide, please, Kathleen. All right, so this just reiterates what we were saying before. See, what I liked about this slide was the fact that, see, the front of that dressage saddle, that flap is nice and straight up and down. The centre of seat is right in the middle of that seat. That's where I want you. When you rise to the trot in this saddle, it's going to make it so much easier for you. It will take the stress off your back and off your stomach muscles. Okay. If you've been riding in a saddle for 6 or 8 months and not having any issues, and suddenly you're getting a sore back or you're getting off and your stomach muscles are sore, that can be a bit of an indication, hey, this saddle's out of balance. And therefore I'm having to use more back muscles or more stomach muscles, okay? That overall long line shows that it's a balance from front to back. And the other thing to understand here is that that balance point is in relationship to the ground, not to the line of the back, because horses' back will have a different line. Some will be built uphill, some will be built downhill. We don't fit the saddle parallel to the horse's back. We sit it parallel to the ground, so that means that you're dropping straight down with gravity. Okay, so just important to understand that and to keep an eye on it and keep checking it. You know, this saddle is quite a big block saddle. You want that block nice and vertical. If it's not vertical, then it'll have an impact on the rider position. Quite a deep saddle, so you want to sit in the deepest part of the seat. You don't want to sit towards the back or towards the front, because you're losing the advantage of the deep seat as well. So saddles are designed to sit in a balanced way to give you the most amount of support. So having them sitting balanced or having them out of balance is a waste of money and what you've invested in the saddle. So keep that in mind. So hopefully that's all clear. I presume if there's any questions about this, you'll pass them on through Kathleen, and happy to answer those, but we'll move along to the next slide, Kathleen. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is panel fit. Okay, now panel fit is, we've now got the saddle sitting balanced from front to back, and these 3 saddles in this particular photo, they're all balanced in the seat, so to speak, but there's 3 totally different types of panel fit. Okay, every horse has a certain amount of dip in the center of his back. Even a very flat backed horse has a little bit of curve to the shape of his back. Now, technically it's referred to the amount of sway in the back, but of course sway is a word that we're quite frightened of with horses. We don't want anyone to tell us our horses got a sway back. Well, in actual fact, every horse has a sway. It's the degree of sway that they have. Okay, and then when a saddle maker builds a saddle, he puts a certain amount of curvature in the tree from front to back. Now, in an ideal world, in a perfect world, the curve on the tree of the saddle should match the curve in the shape of the back. And if we're talking about a lot of curve, or we're talking about a very flat back, then tree shape is really important. And it will be another one of those things why I come to a fatal flaw and I actually sack a saddle and say, no, it can't fit this horse. Because again, every saddle maker builds his saddle according to his own formulas, if you like. Okay, he builds what he believes is the right shaped tree. If he builds a lot of curve into his tree, and we then go and put that saddle on a flat backed horse, we'll have the situation as in the photo where it says rocking underneath. So now, because we're too curvy in the tree, what will happen is that saddle will rock back and forth. All we've done is created a seesaw, so that when we're riding on that saddle, we will, every time we go to particularly to rise to the trot, the saddle will drop in front. Then when we sit back in the saddle, it'll drop behind. It becomes very annoying to both the rider and the horse. The rider's trying to do their darndest to sit still on a moving platform. The horse is trying to use his back along its whole length, and he's got this pressure point right in the middle of the panel. So he's having his back restricted. So it can be very uncomfortable. Now, so that can be because the tree's got too much curve in it. It can also be because the panel doesn't have enough stuffing in the front or the back, or both. So it's not always a fatal flaw. Sometimes I'll look at that situation and say, all right, I'll take a bit of stuffing out of the middle of the saddle, and I'll add a bit to the front and the back and give that horse a nice even weight bearing throughout. And that saddle can work. I'm not saying it's totally unworkable, but if it's a really big curve in the tree and a really flat back, then it will be unworkable and you'll have to find something else. So this is where we're adjusting the panel to fit the shape of the back. The next photo in the middle has got the term bridging under it. So now this is the opposite to the first one. So now we've got a horse that has got a little bit of a dip in the middle of his back, a degree of sway, and we've got a saddle tree that is quite flat from front to back. Now, it might not be completely flat. It may still be the same tree as off the first one. And in this photo, that's exactly what it's meant to be. It's the same tree, but this horse has got more curve in his back than the tree has in it. So that creates what we call bridging. Bridging is when we have a gap under the middle where the blue arrow is, and we have all the pressure being taken where the green arrows are. So we have what we call a 4-point contact. We have 2 points of contact at the back and 2 points of contact at the front. This is probably one of the most common scenarios I see in saddle fitting virtually every day of the week, okay? But getting more common perhaps now than it was, because a lot of modern saddles do have quite flat trees, because a lot of the horses that we're breeding now have fairly flat backs. The warm blood crosses, the Clyde crosses, you know, the better bred, the better shaped thoroughbreds, even the ponies. We're making a lot of trees flatter. However, there's still plenty of horses there that have some dip in their back, and so they'll get this bridging scenario. The big problem with bridging, the rocking saddle's often very obvious to spot. Somebody watching you ride will say, oh, the saddle's lifting off his back every time you take your weight out of the seat. The bridging saddle will actually sit quite still. It can be quite balanced from front to back, and you're not feeling any movement. But what the horse is feeling is this pressure points in front and back. The ones in front are locking up his shoulders, restricting his ability to use his shoulders. The ones at the back here are digging in, a bit like a saddle that's too low behind, and putting pressure on that sensitive part at the back of the saddle. So this one can be an unseen culprit that I often have to deal with, and I'll come along and they'll say, oh, look, I think the saddle fits okay, but he's not happy. He's not moving out. Sometimes you might even get to the point where you'll have white hairs in the front of the saddle. And so they'll think the saddle's too narrow. I'll look at the gullet and say, no, the gullet's not too narrow. It's the fact that the bridge is there and therefore putting more pressure in the front part of that saddle. Now, again, quite often, depending on the make of saddle and the panel room, this can be quite relatively easy to compensate for. I add flocking to the centre part of the saddle from front to back. Or if it happens to be, say, a bait saddle, I'll use the baits inserts to take the weight through the middle, get the weight bearing nice and even through the middle, and I'll solve this problem. In getting the weight bearing through the middle, I'll actually take pressure out of the front and out of the back without actually changing them. So I haven't changed the front of the saddle. Quite often in this situation, when you first put the saddle on and you'll feel down the front, you'll say, oh, it's far too tight in front. It needs a wider gullet. But a bit more investigation will reveal that the bridging is there. And when I correct the bridging and then you run your hand down the front of the saddle again, all of a sudden, oh no, the gullet's not too tight at all. It's just that we've been focusing all the pressure in the front because of that bridge. So by addressing the bridge from front to back, we'll get a nice even weight distribution, and hence we go to the last photo in the scene in the series there on the end, where we've now got three arrows, all of the same size, all of the same dimensions, and they're distributing weight along the whole length of that panel. Okay, we've got that nice big even footprint that I talked about before. Okay, so it's taking the rider's weight and distributing it over a nice big area, nice and evenly. Okay, and so suddenly the same saddle on the same back, the horse in these first two scenarios can be having all sorts of problems moving out and traveling freely. He'll now travel, you know, much more freely and much more evenly under that saddle, and consequently you'll have a much better ride as well. So panel adjustment is very, very important. One of the things that happened, you know, a number of years ago when saddles started to appear on the market with changeable gullets, and, you know, people were almost encouraged to change their own gullets, is that virtually never, and never's a strong word, but, you know, virtually never do I adjust the gullet without then adjusting the panel as well. Okay, the two work in harmony. One complements the other. Without one, the other doesn't work. No good adjusting the panel without getting the right gullet. It's no good getting the right gullet without getting the right panel fit. Okay, so it is just as important as getting the right gullet. And so often, and look, unfortunately, some of the advertising material and promotion material will make it sound like, oh, you know, we've got to change the gullet here. Just change the gullet, and the saddle will fit your horse, and away you go. 99.9% of the times, that is not the case. We still have to adjust that gullet, that panel as well. Okay. The thing to bear in mind with panel adjustment is that there are several different types of material that saddle makers will put inside panels. Okay, and depending on what they use in there as to how much adjustment I can make, and how deep they've made the panel as well. If they've made the panel very shallow, and some saddle makers will do that deliberately to try and get a nice close contact, and close contact is very good in theory. But if you've got a horse that's got a shape that doesn't allow us to have that close contact, and we need to put to lift the saddle, then we haven't got enough room in the panel to do that. So we run out of room. So we physically can't, you know, particularly with bridging, with some of those close contact saddles that are very shallow in the panel through the middle, and they've done it deliberately because they want it to fit those really broad, round shapes. I can't physically get enough stuffing in the middle on a horse that's got a bit of depth to his back. I can't physically get enough stuffing in the middle to make that saddle fit. So again, we might get to a situation where I say, yeah, this saddle bridges. I can't fix the bridging, so I'm sorry. It's not going to work. The other materials that you'll sometimes find in panels will be foam. The trouble with foam is, again, in certain situations it's fine, but if I have to adjust it, I can't get in there and move the foam. I can't add foam. I can't subtract foam. With a flock material, I can add, subtract, or move the flock. So foam can be a bit limiting as well. The other major one you see on the market here in Australia, particularly, is the care panels, which are in the Bates and the Wintex saddles. Now, they're an airbag combined with an adjustment system. They can be adjusted a lot, so they have a really good adjustment system built into them as well. But it's done with what they call a care insert. It's an insert system that goes above the care bag. The care bag itself is actually relatively shallow. It's not particularly thick, and it's there just to give you that nice soft interface. So they can be very, very good and adjustable. Again, though, it's very important that they are adjusted in the panel. Again, some of the publicity and marketing material will lead you to believe that if I change the gullet, that the care panel will take care of everything else, and that's actually not the case. It's crucial that you adjust that panel as well. And again, 99.9% of the time, I'll adjust the gullet, and I will have to adjust that panel in some way. So, so when I come to recommending saddles to people, obviously, because of what it is I do, I'm going to recommend saddles that have got a high degree of adjustability. Okay, there are still, unfortunately, quite a few saddles out there that don't have a high degree of adjustability. If at any time anyone ever says to you that one saddle will fit every horse, you know that person doesn't know what they're talking about, or is being less than generous, because the reality is that all horses' backs are different, and so therefore one saddle, which may be a brilliant saddle, you know, when I say to somebody, no, this saddle doesn't fit the horse, I'll always say, I'm not saying it's a bad saddle. It might be a great saddle. But on this particular horse, because he's got a particular curvy back, or because he's got a particular straight back, or because he's built particularly uphill or downhill, this particular saddle, whatever it might be, mightn't work. You know, the same thing will apply to any brand, you know, whether it be Bates, PDS, Kiefer, Steuben, Pessoa. There's no bad brands. There's just suitability to the individual horse that you're putting it on. And it's one of the reasons that, you know, I'll often say to people, if you get a new horse, before you rush out and buy a new saddle for it, get a good, reputable, qualified saddle fitter to have a look at it and say, you know, all right, what this horse needs is he needs a saddle that's got more curve in the tree. He needs a saddle that's got less curve in the tree. He needs a saddle that's got a nice deep panel. I'll often look at a horse, particularly say a thoroughbred horse that's built a bit uphill. I know I'm going to have to put quite a bit of stuffing in the back part of the saddle to get a balanced seat line and keep my clearance in front. So I'll make sure I recommend a saddle that's got a nice deep panel behind that gives me plenty of room to adjust that back part of the panel. So, when it comes to saddle selection, there isn't a one saddle suits all horses situation. Yes, with a saddle that's got a really high degree of adjustability, and without sort of wanting to advertise any saddles, that's not what I'm about. But there are saddles like the PDS, like the Bates, like the Pessoas. They have really good adjustable gullet systems, really good big roomy panels in general. Not all models, but most models, okay? And it often does vary. I might recommend one model of a maker and say that'll be good for the horse, but another model by the same maker that isn't suitable for that horse. And that will be because one might have shallow panels and one might have deep panels, or vice versa. So, but the amount of adjustability that's built into a saddle does mean that it can fit a much wider variety of types. Okay, so the more adjustability, the wider the range of horses it's going to fit. So when you're looking at a new saddle, make sure you are very aware of how much adjustability is in the saddle that you're looking at buying, and have had someone look at the horse beforehand. Okay. I don't know how we're going for time, Kathleen. You want me to wind up?
No, if you've got more to say, then and that's all good. We do have some questions for you, Robert, right, yeah. But I just thought I'd put the last page up in case people wanted to contact you direct. Yeah. Yep. So
ask a few questions. I was going to briefly mention saddle pads, but as I said to Kathleen before, saddle pads are nearly almost a complete section on themselves, because they are something that is drastically used incorrectly and misunderstood how they use. So just to give you something for now is, if you're going to use a pad under your saddle, understand thoroughly and properly what you want that pad to do. And then ask yourself, is the pad that I've selected going to do that? So many people use pads when they're not quite sure of what it is they want the pad to do, and then they're not quite sure if the pad they've selected is going to do it. So there are a lot of very good pads on the market, but the trouble is a lot of them are misused. But look, that might be a topic for another time. But happy to answer any questions, though. Go on, Kathleen. Ask a few questions.
Okay, so Anne asks, what girth do you recommend for a well set back shoulder?
Okay, if you've got a well set back shoulder, and particularly stand back and have a look at the girth notch on the horse. Now that's that section of the bottom of the horse from behind the elbow back to where it starts to taper up towards his flank. Now, if he's got a nice, broad, flat girth notch, in other words, you can sit that saddle anywhere along that girth notch, and it's not going to want to move. And sometimes you'll be quite surprised. The saddle, the girth can sit, a good 6-8 inches or more back from the elbow, but it's still going to sit nice and still there because it's a nice flat girth notch. In that case, just any good quality. I like a bit of elasticity in a girth, but not too much elasticity. Remember what I said earlier. The main function of a girth is to keep the saddle still. If we have too much elasticity in the girth, it's too elastic, then it actually can't do that, because it'll just keep stretching and generating movement. So, but a bit of elasticity is important, because we are girthing up over the sternum. We want the horse to be able to breathe. So a bit of elasticity, but a nice standard girth. Now, however, if we find that the girth notch is forward, so we come down that belly and there's a big circular belly and it goes up just behind the elbow into a real specific girth notch. And a lot of ponies can be have that type of build. Now, in that type of situation, what we've got to have is an anatomical girth. So that's a girth where the girth's going to drop down off the girth points. Then it's going to have a curve in it where it moves forward, goes across under the horse, and then another curve on the other side to move it back. So in actual fact, what we're doing is we're girthing up. I've just got to get my line right here. So the girth is wanting to fall here. This is the elbow here. We're going to bring it down off the girth points, move it forward, in behind the elbow, and then back out to the girth. So some very good anatomical girths out there to help you with that problem, if that's your problem. And if you've got a horse where you put the saddle on, you girth it up in the right position up on top, but very quickly the saddle gets pulled forward by the girth because the girth wants to slide forward into that notch, then often an anatomical girth is the solution. So give that some thought.
Thank you, Rob. Rob, you mentioned different saddles and their fit. How about half-breed and Western saddles?
All right, really good question, and again could be a whole hour and a half of talk by itself. But just to give you the main thing, the most important thing to understand about Western saddles and half-breed saddles is they're built on totally rigid trees. So they have no adjustability in their tree whatsoever. And they're also very rigid trees in that they don't have much flex or give in them at all, okay? Now, they do that deliberately because they want a really strong tree, and that's their main function. Then they combine that with a very flat, broad panel, again, that has no adjustability built into it. Or most of them don't have adjustability built in them. There is a few out there now that are starting to get adjustability, and there is Sid Hill make a half-breed style saddle that does have a changeable gullet, but they're about the only one at the moment. So there is a couple experimenting with it. So when it comes to those sort of saddles, you need to understand that because you've got no adjustability, it's very important that when you buy your saddle, you get it wide enough for the withers of that horse. They'll talk in terms of standard trees or semi-quarter horse trees or full quarter horse trees. They're just another way of saying, medium wide. They also have an extra wide version as well. But very important that if you're going to buy a saddle, you get the horse measured properly first and buy a saddle with a gullet that's wide enough. Then you need to understand that they've got no internal padding in them, unlike an English saddle. So their padding is done externally through the saddle pad. And that's why with a Western saddle or a half-breed saddle, you're going to use, a really thick saddle blanket. The secret is to understand the individual saddle and how it fits the horse, and therefore what style of pad I need to use on it. When I do a saddle fitting for a half-breed saddle or a Western saddle, which I do quite a lot of, it's not about adjusting the saddle the way it is with an English saddle. It's about saying, all right, this saddle on this horse needs this style of pad. And it might be a 12 mil pad, a 20 mil pad, a 25 mil pad. It might be a wedge pad front to back or back to front. Or it might even be a pad that helps us compensate for bridging. So we can't adjust the saddle internally, so we're adjusting it externally by getting that pad right. So yeah, very important. Saddle selection is much more important in a lot of ways with those saddles because they can't be adjusted as much.
Thank you, Rob. The next question is, I have a saddle that fits pretty well on a horse, but I've noticed that the back of the saddle slides and twists from side to side quite a bit. What could I do to fix this?
Okay, that's what we call saddle cant. And if we stand behind any horse and watch them trot away from us, the saddle will cant from left to right. It'll go like that. It should never be too much. It shouldn't be too much cant, and it should always return to the centre. If we've got an excessive amount of saddle cant, it usually has to do with actually the front of the saddle, because the way a saddle works, it's a rigid structure on the back, and as the one shoulder moves back, it engages the right front of the saddle, and so that pushes the back of the saddle to the left. As he takes the next stride and the left shoulder comes back, it pushes the back of the saddle to the right. If we've got a loaded shoulder, a particularly prominent shoulder or big shoulder, what it can do is create really excessive saddle cant. To overcome that, what we often have to do, it will get back to our gullet selection. We may have done as in that slide that showed us the two different views from the back. We may have a gullet that, yeah, technically is the right size for where it's sitting, but it's not allowing enough room for the shoulder to work without pushing the saddle from left to right behind. So we need to actually widen the gullet a little bit, maybe use a bit of stuffing then to get the seat line back. And what that will do is allow the shoulder to work under the saddle without moving the saddle excessively behind. Okay, so that's one of the problems. There are a couple other issues. It may be relating to the fact that there is some rock in the saddle. The saddle might be rocking. Because it's rocking, and again, maybe the gullet is not quite right. That rocking might be creating excessive movement behind. So not an uncommon problem. Can, depending on how the saddle and what saddle you're using, can quite often be rectified. But yeah, it's possibly got to do with the gullet selection and some padding in front. So,
thank you. Another question: can a better or more balanced rider compensate for the effect of a poorly fitted saddle compared to an inexperienced, unbalanced rider in the same saddle?
Look, great question, terrific question, because there's no doubt that rider ability impacts on the consequences of a badly fitting saddle. Okay, if you've got a saddle that's wanting to roll from left to right, for instance, because it's not quite a good fit and the horse is really roly-poly, that wants to go from left to right, we get a really experienced, balanced rider on that, and they sit nice and centered on the horse, and they put their weight in their irons completely evenly. They can keep that saddle fairly still on that horse because of their ability to balance themselves on top of it. We take that same horse, same saddle, we put a less experienced rider who's not quite as balanced, a little bit less coordinated, puts a little bit more weight in one iron than the other, and next thing we've got a saddle that's moving around underneath the horse, you know. So absolutely. It doesn't mean, however, that the horse is going to be more comfortable under the saddle. Yes, the better rider might be able to get the situation a bit better, but the weight distribution won't have changed. So if I've got a bridging saddle, for instance, and I've got a really heavy seated, inexperienced rider in it, so they're sort of sitting there, you know, a bit like a sack of potatoes, so to speak, they may get that horse sore in the back very quickly, particularly if they're very heavy at rising to the trot. They come down with a bit of a jarring motion. They might make that horse sore in the back after 2 or 3 rides. Same situation with a really experienced, balanced, light in the seat sort of rider who, you know, because of their experience, their movement in the saddle is minimal. They don't slap on the saddle. They don't bang on the saddle. They maybe get that horse to go along in that saddle for, you know, weeks without any real soreness. They will, however, eventually get soreness. They haven't completely eliminated the problem. What they've done is mitigated the consequences of that problem, I suppose. But yeah, no, rider experience can have quite an impact.
Thank you. Our next question is from Deb again, and she asks, we see lots of synthetic saddles at Pony Club which are very light. Does an ill-fitting synthetic saddle cause any less discomfort to the horse than a leather one?
Good question again. Some good questions here, Kathleen.
Yeah.
Again, it's one of the things we've got to be very careful with horses, with all aspects of horses, is a word that I love to use, and I didn't think I was going to get to use it tonight, but this question allows me to use it. There's a syndrome called anthropomorphism, and that's when we put human feelings onto animals. Now, we might pick up a synthetic saddle that's really light and say, oh, isn't that lovely? And then we pick up a leather saddle and we say, oh, that's twice as heavy. That's not going to be comfortable on the horse. The reality is, for the average horse in the average situation, the weight of that saddle isn't going to make a big difference, okay? What makes the difference is the gullet angle, the panel fit, and the balance. So if we've got a synthetic saddle that weighs, you know, 3 or 4 kilos, but it's too narrow in the gullet, got a bridge in it, isn't balanced, that's going to cause the horse just as much problems as the leather saddle that might weigh 7 or 8 kilos. And it's got the same problems. They're going to cause the same sorts of problems. So the weight of the saddle, unless we're doing something like, you know, horse racing or endurance riding, the average weight difference between a leather saddle and synthetic saddle is not going to be really relevant in the average riding situation, you know, even at a high level of competition. It's only something like, you know, endurance riding or race riding where might make a little bit of a difference. It is the fit. It is the gullet angle. So just because you're using, and this, again, something I come across quite often, unfortunately, someone's gone out and bought themselves just a cheap synthetic saddle, you know. Oh, you know, they've only paid, you know, $400 or $500 for this cheap saddle. You know, I'm not going to then go and pay some money to have it fitted. I'll just plonk it on the horse and use it. That's going to cause you just as much problem had you gone out and bought a $5,000 saddle and that didn't fit, you know. So spending, consequently, just because you paid $5,000 for a saddle doesn't mean you can bring it home and plonk it straight on the horse and he'll be fine. You know, because that's the other statement that I'll hear. Oh, you know, I've paid $5,000 for this saddle. I shouldn't have to then have to pay to get it fitted. Well, unfortunately, saddles aren't an off-the-rack thing. Even the most expensive saddle usually needs to be fitted to the individual horse it's going to be used on. So.
Thank you. Is it okay to have your girth done up on different holes on the same size to make the girth even pressure?
I presume this means on the same side.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Quite common, particularly with saddles. A lot of modern dressage saddles have what we call a Y girthing system. And that's where, you know, the traditional way of girthing was when we just had the 2 points that came down off the middle of the saddle. Dressage saddles will have a Y girthing system. So the front one may come off the tree point, be a point strap, and then the back one will come off further down the saddle. That's what we call a balance point. So we've got this Y girthing system, okay? A very common and a very good system, mind you. Now, depending on how the horse is built, quite often for those to girth up on different holes. You might have one on 4 and one on 5, or one on, you know, they usually won't be 2 or 3 holes different, but it's quite common for them to do 1 hole different. The other thing that kicks in is those girth points are made of leather. Leather stretches under pressure. Different bits of leather can stretch more or less. So they may look exactly the same, but one might be a little bit more stretch than the other. So you may get that appear over time. You may buy it when they're new and they might be on even holes. And then after 6 or 12 months, they might be a hole different. What I tell my clients to do is the amount of holes below the buckle have no impact on either you or the horse. It is the pressure above the buckles. So when you girth your horse up, you put your fingers in just above the buckles, and I want roughly an even pressure on those 2 girth points so that I've got an even pull on that saddle. I don't want more pressure in front or more pressure behind. I want an even pull on those 2 points, okay? And if that's the case, then that's fine, okay? If your saddle gets badly out of shape from a fitting point of view, then that pressure may vary and may change, and that may be a sign. If it suddenly changes, then sometimes it's a sign that your saddle fitting needs to be checked.
Okay, so our next question's a little bit of a long one. I hear sweat patches on a horse, and the lack of sweat patches are an indication of pressure. Are sweat patches relevant? Do white hairs mean that the horse has not got blood going to that point, or is this called wives' tale? The older types of saddles, for example, Kiefer, are very narrow in the gullet towards the cantle end of the saddle. Is this because the horse's shape has changed over time, or is it just the gains in saddle fitting knowledge?
Okay, you're right. It's a very long question. I'll start from the back and work forward, actually.
All right.
What you're talking about with the Kiefer saddle is channel fit. And one of the biggest changes in saddle design in my time in saddles is the fact that we understand so much more about those muscles down either side of the horse's back and keeping pressure off those spinous processes. Those little lumps, when you run your fingers down a horse's back, those little lumps are actually the tips of the spinous processes. And we understand that each one of those spinous processes has a very complicated group of little ligaments that connect them. They're all connected by synovial sac joints and very complicated and needs to be not put under any pressure at all. So we've, or when I say we, the saddle industry and saddle designers have realised that we need to give them plenty of width. That's why early on I was talking about gullet clearance. I was talking about not only having vertical clearance, but lateral clearance. When we look down the channel of a saddle without a saddle blanket on, I want to see those panels sitting out, you know, well away from the spinous processes. And so what's happened with particularly the early keepers and Steubens and quite a lot of those old saddles, they had very narrow channels, okay? And we now know that that's not good. And it's one of the reasons a lot of those old saddles that I'm called out to have a look, and I say, look, really, this saddle is just too old a design to use on most modern horses, okay? So, yeah, it is an improvement in the design of saddles. It also, you do get what we call channel creep. As a panel gets older and the leather surrounding it gets softer and stretches, it allows the panel to actually stretch into the gullet, into the channel of a saddle. And so sometimes they weren't made that way originally, but over the years they've got very narrow in the channel. So yes, that's not a good thing at all. All right, then to move forward, white patches for a start. White patches are created by medium to severe pressure over a long period of time on a small area. Yes, it has to do with blood flow into that area, but the actual white coloration comes about from that pressure damaging the hair follicle. The hair follicle dies. When it grows back, the colour component is destroyed in the hair cell or the hair follicle itself. So that's why we get the white patches. The white patches in and of themselves are just an indication of the deeper down muscle damage. Okay, if we get white patches, they generally, once we've got them, they don't go away. The hair follicle is damaged for life. They may vary a little bit in their intensity because horse hair is the same as hair on our head. We're constantly having individual hair follicles die and fall out and new ones grow. Same on a horse. But it is an indication of increased pressure in that area, okay? So, yes, if you have some white hair suddenly appear, you should check your saddle fitting straight away. Thing to understand about white hairs is the time frame. It does depend on the cycle of the coat. So if we have damage, for instance, at the end of winter, we get some pressure damage. Those white hairs may appear, but they will, as soon as the new coat comes through. The cycle will never be less than 6 to 8 weeks, though, between damage and the white hair appearing. So if I see a white hair today, it's not damage that I've done last week, it's damage that I've done 6 weeks ago. However, if they get their new coat, say at the start of winter or at the start of spring, and I do the damage then, the white hairs mightn't appear until the new coat comes through at the end of summer or at the end of winter. So it can be up to 3 or 4 months before that white hair comes back. So it is quite a slow, long process for that white hair to appear. Often people will call me out because white hairs appear and they said, oh, I went for a long ride last weekend and I've got white hairs this weekend. And I'll say, don't worry, it wasn't last weekend's ride that caused those. It was pressure from 6 or 8 weeks ago. It's usually long-term pressure. It's not something, it can happen from one ride, but it'd have to be probably a 7 or 8 hour ride. More likely it's the fact that you've been riding in it, say a gullet that's too narrow, and you've been riding in it for a couple of months, that you'll get white hairs. Certain breeds of horses or certain styles of horses will get white hair a lot easier than others. If you've got a chestnut horse that's got a bit of a grey fleck through him, for instance, he'll get white hairs quite easily. It doesn't have to be a lot of pressure, and he'll get white hairs. And that's because he's got the white hair gene in him already, and so he reacts to the pressure quite quickly. So, no, white hairs, always, if they're a fresh new white hair, always you would always have your saddle fitting checked, okay? Very importantly. But if you buy a horse and he's got some white hairs there, don't expect them to disappear because you get your saddle fitted or because you've changed the saddle. So once they're there, they're generally there for life, okay? The first part of the question, the last to answer, is about sweat patches. Now, sweat patches are a really interesting area of saddle fitting, a really interesting thing to read. The thing to understand about sweat patches is that they can have contradictory indications. If we put a saddle on that bridges, for instance, and take the horse for a short 10 or 15 minute ride, he'll actually sweat more. He may sweat more under the pressure points than he will under the area that's got no pressure at all. If we stay on that horse for another hour and take the saddle off, now what will happen is the pressure points will have gone dry and the area with no pressure will have sweated up. So the amount of time you're sitting in the saddle will give you a different sweat pattern. You can also get dry patches. So in general, the dry patches in general terms, but not always, are an increase of pressure because the increased pressure is blocking the sweat gland from below the skin, not letting the sweat get out into the skin. So in general, they are a pressure point, but they can also be related to old injury. If we've had particularly bad saddle fitting damage done to a horse's back, then he may never sweat in that area of that damage again. Even if we fix the saddle and get the best saddle fitting we can possibly get, he may still not sweat in that spot. So the official Society of Master Saddlers line on dry patches is that you should always investigate dry patches, check your saddle fitting. However, if you can't find a reason, for the dry patches in the saddle fitting, you don't alter the saddle just trying to fix the dry patch, because there are other reasons the dry patch could be there that may have nothing to do with saddle fitting. So it's not, unfortunately, it's not a definitive answer, but if you, the thing I say is always investigate the change. So if you've never had a dry patch and you've suddenly got a dry patch, then investigate it. Get the saddle fitting checked. If you've had your saddle fitting checked, you're absolutely confident the saddle fits really well, and you've still got a dry patch, you may just have to ignore the dry patch.
The next question is, how much does the horse's back change shape from standing still to moving? Again, a really good question. Again, a really varying question in the answer to that. And yes, the horse changes shape. One of the things we talk about is how much the centre of the back lifts up once you get a horse properly engaged and rounded in the back. Okay. Yes, there's a change. It's not as much as some people would have you believe. It's nowhere near as much, because when we talk about a horse rounding his back, he's rounding his back from his poll to his tail over the full length of his back. He's not rounding the 12 or 18 inches of back directly below the saddle. That's lifting the whole saddle up into that collected position. It's not just rising in the middle of the panel. There was a school of thought some years ago now that developed that said we should leave some bridging in the saddle to allow for the lifting of the back. What fairly quickly happened, and particularly in most sort of mainstream thinking, if you like, with the organisations like the Society of Master Saddlers, etc., where they do a lot of testing on this sort of thing. They were using pressure pads under the saddle to see what was happening. It was fairly quickly realised that if we leave a bridge there, we'll have an uneven weight distribution across the horse's back. He won't actually be able to round up as well with that bridging. So it will prevent him lifting his back and filling that supposed void in the bottom of the saddle. He'll fairly quickly get sore from front to back. So in general terms, if we fit the static back with a nice even weight distribution, and we have a nice giving panel, and that's very important. The term I will often use is a healthy panel. Now, a healthy panel is when I can turn that saddle upside down, and I press into the flocking of the saddle, and I've got some give with my thumb. I'm not pressing on a bit of wood. I'm pressing on something like a firm cushion, if you like, and it needs to be firm because it's got to take your weight. It can't be soft and squishy. It's got to be reasonably firm. But I've got that give in the panel, and it's actually that give in the panel that will compensate for the change in the shape of the horse's back once it starts to move. Okay, so it's what the
you know, it's the whole premise that a panel like the Care panel or the English Flare panel, which is another airbag panel, it's the whole premise of their basis, of their thinking, if you like, is that the airbag helps to change the shape of that panel as the horse changes his shape in the work, okay? But again, you have to start with an even weight distribution to start with, and then just allow the give in the panel to compensate for the change in the horse's back. So, yes, they change, but it doesn't mean that we're going to leave gaps and things under the saddle to compensate for it.
So we have another question come through. I go to boarding school and so ride a lot more during holidays, and then not at all during school term. Will these changes in workload affect her back shape in a way which will impact her saddle fit?
Oh, look, you know, another good question. I'm very impressed with the question, Kathleen. Make sure you pass that on to the people. Obviously, this is a very common scenario. You know, I'm constantly have, you know, kids that go to school, so they can only ride over a weekend. And then, of course, come, you know, school holidays, particularly Christmas holidays, all of a sudden they go from riding 2 days a week to riding, you know, 5 or 6 or 7 days a week, you know. And so, yes, the bottom line is that is going to affect the shape of the horse, okay? Depending on how dramatic a difference it is as to how dramatic the shape of the horse is going to change. If you're just talking about someone, you know, say the 2 week holiday, you know, the mid-year holidays where you're off for 2 weeks, the reality is that 2 weeks is probably not quite enough to change the shape so dramatically that it's going to affect the saddle fitting really disastrously, you know. Particularly with the one that they're going off to boarding school, you know, the chances are that even if the horse is a little bit sore by the end of the 2 weeks, then they're off to boarding school for another 6 weeks and the horse recovers fine. You do want to start with a saddle that fits pretty well to start with. And if it's a good, healthy panel, as I was talking about before, with a properly fitting gullet, then it's going to get through that 2 weeks of riding without too many problems, okay? I'd be very surprised if 2 weeks is enough. The summer holidays become a whole different kettle of fish because they could be anything from 6 to 8 weeks, you know, and if you're an older student, it might even be, you know, very nearly 12 weeks. Now you're starting to talk about some really significant change in the horse's back, okay? The answer is that, you know, you've got your saddle fitting checked at some stage during the year. When you come home for that Christmas holiday break and you start riding, you need to time it that perhaps after about 3 or 4 weeks, you know, of constant riding and constant work, that you get your saddle fitted at that, or checked at that stage, okay? So now you've had your saddle fitting pretty well before the holiday started, you know, to what is the normal out of work sort of shape. You've got into some serious work, then have it checked perhaps, as I say, 3 or 4 weeks into those Christmas holidays to get that, to check that saddle fitting, okay? Depending on, look, it all depends on the type of work. Are we just going for a walk around the paddock, having a slummock around, as they say, or are we having riding lessons and really collecting the horse up and doing some proper, you know, engaged type of work? Well, if it's proper engaged type of work, it's going to change the horse's back more dramatically and perhaps more quickly. So bottom line is, yes, it's a movable, changeable platform, and you do have to accommodate for what it is that our lifestyle does to them. So yeah, you have to be on your toes.
Well, that seems to be all in the questions, Rob.
Yep. All right.
So I think we've covered it. Lots of, actually we have one last one.
Yep.
You said that once a year is a good guide for saddle fitting. What time of year would you suggest is the most beneficial, important time of the year to do it? In brackets, it can be an expensive exercise, especially for parents with multiple children and horses.
Yeah, look, and I'm very aware of that. That's one of the things when I'm recommending this, that, you know, it's not everyone, you know, has the finances to do this sort of stuff unlimited amount. And yes, there are some parents out there that have 2 or 3 riders in the family. What you need to do is, once again, it's an individual. The answer to that question isn't the same for every horse, unfortunately. You need to know your horse a little bit, and you need to know, is there a season when they do get affected by that season, you know? Now, you know, for example, often say a thoroughbred horse, you know, you'll often hear the expression, thoroughbred horses don't winter well. They lose a bit of condition in the winter, okay? So they can change in the winter. So that means that, you know, with a thoroughbred horse that doesn't winter well, then he probably needs his saddle fitted coming out the other side of that, you know, in that early part of spring, you know. Then you'll get some of the crossbred horses and the ponybred horses that, you know, they handle the winter really well, and then they balloon up as soon as there's a bit of green grass, you know. So maybe they need to wait until after that green grass has sort of run its course, and you might have them checked more in the summer or you know, later into the season to see how their saddle's going. So unfortunately, there isn't one answer. It's about knowing your horse and knowing what his cycle is. Does he do really well at certain times of year, or does he do not well at certain times of year? You can tie it in with the riding cycle as well. Do the kids ride much more over the summer than they do during the winter? So if they're riding much more over the summer, probably more important to have it checked at the beginning of that session rather than at the start of the winter session, you know. So, but it is unfortunately not a one size fits all question. I wish it was, and that does make it difficult. But sometimes what I'll do is I'll talk to people about pads, and this is, you know, a situation where if we know the horse's cycle and we know that he doesn't winter well and he drops off in the winter, but he puts it on very quickly in the spring, well, there are pads that we might use during the winter to compensate for his change, so that then he can get through and we can then fit him again when he's back to more his normal shape in the spring or the summer. So that's not out of the question either.
Thank you, Rob. I think that was a fabulous webinar, and I think there'll be lots of people checking out their saddles and popping them on the horses in the morning.
Yeah. That's good. I hope I didn't drag on too long.
No, it was perfect. I think what was great was that you gave examples for lots of different types of horses and ponies, and you know, any typical pony club rally. There's a huge variety of different saddles and horses out there. So on behalf of Pony Club Victoria, I just wanted to thank you again for providing your time and putting this fantastic presentation together for everybody to tune into. Thank you.
No worries, my pleasure. Enjoy, everyone, and keep safe.
Thank you. And a copy of the webinar will be provided to attendees, and we've recorded the session, so that'll be available through the website and Facebook and emails shortly. Thank you again, Rob, and good night, everybody.
My pleasure. Take care, everyone, and keep safe. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.